I remember the exact evening as if the words were engraved into the walls of that apartment, refusing to fade no matter how many times I tried to scrub the memory from my mind. It wasn't a fight, not at first. It was casual, almost lighthearted, one of those moments when you're sitting at the table after dinner, half distracted, half settled into the comfort of routine. He had been unusually animated, fingers tapping on the edge of his phone, eyes bright with a kind of restless excitement. I thought it was about work, or maybe a promotion, something harmless. But then, with the kind of nonchalance that can only come from someone who doesn't realize the weight of what they're about to drop, he said he was going to travel. The way he phrased it made me pause. He didn't say we're going, he didn't say maybe we should. He said it like it was already set in stone, decided without me. My curiosity grew when he said the destination, some coastal city we had once joked about visiting together but never did. Then the second blow came, the part that shifted the air in the room, made it heavier, sharper, colder. He was going with his ex. He said her name as if it were just another piece of the sentence, a harmless detail tucked in between flight times and hotel options. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't even anticipate that my entire body would tense at the sound. I didn't scream, though the initial surge of disbelief almost forced something out of me. Instead, I blinked slowly, tried to convince myself I had misheard. Maybe he meant a group trip. Maybe he meant an accident of words. But when I asked, with as much calm as I could stitch together, if he truly intended to go away with her, he nodded, smiling faintly like it was perfectly reasonable, like it was nothing more than two old friends catching up on memories and cocktails by the beach. He had the audacity to add that it would clear the air, that they had unfinished business that had to be resolved face to face, and he expected me, his partner, to accept this explanation like a rational contract, something clinical and detached. I asked him not to. My voice was steady, not begging, not dramatic, simply stating that this crossed a line any person with even a shred of respect for their relationship would see without it needing to be spelled out. I thought, foolishly perhaps, that he would pause, reconsider, maybe soften and say he hadn't really thought it through. Instead, his expression hardened, jaw tightening as though my words were an insult. And then it came, his voice raised, sharp, and filled with a defiance I hadn't heard directed at me before. "I don't need your permission," he yelled, as if I had shackled him, as if I had dared to clip wings he didn't even have. The words reverberated, echoing inside me like they were less about the trip and more about everything I had ignored for months. The subtle dismissals, the way he kept secrets under the guise of privacy, the casual cruelty disguised as independence. The air between us changed after that. It wasn't about a vacation anymore. It wasn't about beaches or flights or an ex-girlfriend. It was about the way he saw me, the way he saw us. His sentence was a declaration that my voice, my presence, my existence in his life was secondary to his impulses. He framed it as independence, but I knew it was entitlement. The look in his eyes wasn't of someone fighting for freedom. It was of someone daring me to protest. Someone who believed they held the power to set the terms of our relationship without question. I remember sitting there, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep from trembling, realizing that this was a moment that would not pass quietly into the catalog of small arguments. This was a fracture, a deep one, the kind that exposed the foundation beneath the surface. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't chase his raised voice with one of my own. Instead, I let silence settle like dust between us, a silence that was heavier than any counter-argument. He mistook it for surrender, I could tell. He leaned back, his anger cooling into a smirk, as though the battle was won, as though I would sulk and then eventually adapt. But deep inside me, something shifted, a thread snapping cleanly. It wasn't rage that filled me, not even jealousy. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that burns away excuses and leaves only the bare truth. In that moment, I knew the trip itself was just a symptom, not the disease. The real betrayal was in the way he treated my boundaries, the way he wielded arrogance like a shield, the way he expected loyalty from me while casually discarding the responsibility of giving it in return. I went to bed that night without another word, staring at the ceiling as his voice replayed, over and over. not in volume, but in meaning. I don't need your permission. It was the echo of someone who had already chosen himself over us, who had already rehearsed a story where I was the obstacle and he was the hero. And lying there in the dark, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself in years, the urge not to fight for us, but to step away and fight for me. This was no longer about stopping him from traveling. It was about recognizing that the man I thought I loved had revealed the version of himself that had always been lurking, waiting for the moment he no longer cared to hide. That night was the first page of a new story, one he didn't realize I was already beginning to write in silence. I would not stop him from going. I would not scream or cling or beg, but I would not remain the quiet casualty of his arrogance either. His words freed me, though he never intended them to. They opened a door I hadn't dared to touch before, a door that would lead me toward truths, toward discoveries, toward alliances, and toward a vengeance he could never see coming. The announcement he thought was just about a trip had become the spark that would burn down everything he believed he controlled. The following days passed with a strange rhythm, as though every hour carried the weight of something unspoken, lingering in the air like smoke after a fire that had not yet been extinguished. His announcement had marked me in a way that I couldn't outwardly display, so I went through the motions with a calmness that must have appeared unsettling to him. He assumed silence meant surrender, and he carried himself with that careless confidence, scrolling through his phone, laughing at videos, humming as he cooked in the kitchen, pretending the fracture he had caused was invisible. But inside, the fracture spread like cracks on glass, stretching wider and deeper every time he smiled as though nothing had changed. I couldn't stop replaying that moment, his words like a hammer against the walls of our home. I don't need your permission. I knew the confrontation had to come. It wasn't about begging or pleading. I had no intention of lowering myself to ask again for what was basic decency. But the words had to be spoken. The clarity had to be laid on the table, even if he would dismiss it. On the third evening, I found him sprawled across the couch, eyes fixed on his laptop screen as he flipped through hotel listings, casually muttering about amenities and packages, as though he were planning a weekend getaway with me. Except, of course, he wasn't. His casualness stung more than his outburst had. It wasn't just arrogance. It was disregard, the refusal to even see me as a participant in the life we supposedly shared. I stood there, watching him, my arms folded tightly against my chest, the quiet stretching between us like a taut string ready to snap. He noticed me eventually, glanced up with that flicker of irritation people get when they realize they're being observed. "What?" he asked, his tone sharp, defensive before I even opened my mouth. That was when I knew he was preparing for another battle, not with fists or obvious cruelty, but with the same weapon he always relied on: dismissal. I walked over, slowly, deliberately, and stood near the arm of the couch. My voice was steady when I asked him the question I had been holding inside, though I already knew the answer. "Are you really going to do this? Go on this trip with her?" For a fleeting second, I searched his face for a trace of hesitation, a flicker of doubt, something that would tell me the man I once trusted was still buried in there. But his eyes hardened, his lips curled into a faint sneer, and he leaned back as if my words amused him. "You're still hung up on that?" he said, almost laughing. "I told you already. It's just a trip. You're blowing it out of proportion." There it was, the casual dismissal, the insinuation that my instincts, my boundaries, my feelings were excessive. And yet, when I pressed further, when I told him plainly that this wasn't about paranoia, but about respect, he shifted, his face tightening with that same anger as before. His voice rose, not in the booming yell of the first night, but in a sharper tone, cutting through the air like glass. "I told you," he spat. "I don't need your permission. You don't get to control who I see or where I go. I'm not your property." He twisted the narrative skillfully, turning his betrayal into a defense of freedom, painting me as the villain trying to cage him. It was a tactic I realized he had probably mastered long before me, a way to make me question myself, to turn my pain into evidence of my supposed irrationality. But this time I didn't flinch. His words rolled over me, heavy and cold, but they did not crush me. Instead, they settled like pieces in a puzzle I had been assembling unconsciously for months, maybe years. I remembered the late-night messages he always angled his phone away from me to hide, the unexplained absences dressed in thin excuses, the smirks he gave when I asked too many questions. It all came together now. The image of a man who thrived on the illusion of superiority, who needed me silent to maintain his stage. His trip with her wasn't just about nostalgia or closure. It was about him choosing the thrill of power over the loyalty of partnership. I didn't raise my voice in return. That would have been feeding into his script, giving him the satisfaction of labeling me dramatic, irrational, controlling. Instead, I lowered it, calm and measured, the kind of tone that unsettles because it doesn't match the storm one expects. I told him that respect was not ownership, that loyalty was not about permission, and that he had already made his choice long before purchasing tickets. He rolled his eyes, muttered something about overreacting, but I saw it. The faint twitch in his jaw, the momentary flicker of discomfort when he realized I wasn't engaging in his theater of conflict. The rest of that night unfolded in silence. He slammed his laptop shut, tossed it onto the coffee table, and retreated to the bedroom, muttering under his breath about how exhausting it was to deal with me. I remained in the living room, staring at the blank television screen, listening to the sound of drawers opening and closing, of him preparing for a trip he thought he could justify as harmless. But in that silence, I wasn't crushed. I was calculating. Each word he had thrown at me became fuel. Each act of disregard became proof. Each attempt to paint me as controlling became a stone I was quietly collecting. What he never understood was that the confrontation at home wasn't about stopping him. It was about letting him show me who he truly was, giving him the rope he was so eager to pull tighter around himself. Every raised voice, every sneer, every arrogant declaration was not a victory for him. It was documentation, evidence, pieces of a story that would one day expose him far more effectively than any argument ever could. That night I went to bed alone, not in body, but in spirit, for the bed we shared no longer felt shared at all. And while he slept, unaware of the storm he had unleashed, I lay awake with clarity hardening inside me like steel. He thought he had won. He thought my silence was surrender, but in truth, it was the sharpening of a blade he would never see coming. In the days that followed, I noticed how something subtle yet irreversible began to settle between us, like dust filling the cracks of an old foundation until it hardened into something permanent. Trust, I realized, doesn't shatter in one loud explosion. It erodes piece by piece with every dismissal, every raised voice, every choice to prioritize selfishness over the bond we claim to share. His defiance during that confrontation had not only left me with bruised dignity, it had revealed something deeper, something I could no longer unsee. Trust had shifted, tilted on its axis, and no matter how much I tried to steady it, it slid further away from me, leaving a void where security had once lived. He walked around the house with a strange air of victory, as though by yelling louder he had proven himself right, as though by reminding me he didn't need my permission, he had solidified some throne he believed he occupied. He mistook my silence for resignation, mistook my quiet observation for retreat, when in reality I was watching him with clearer eyes than ever before. Every word he spoke, every careless gesture, every smirk when he glanced at his phone became evidence not of independence, but of arrogance. And with each moment, I felt the scaffolding of our relationship collapsing in slow motion. I wasn't panicked. There was no desperation to claw at the walls and hold them together. Instead, I felt something colder take root inside me, a detachment that allowed me to see him not as my partner, but as a man already halfway out the door. I noticed how quickly the smallest things began to feel like betrayals. The way he locked his phone screen the moment I entered a room. The way he angled his body away when reading a message. The way he laughed softly to himself at texts I wasn't meant to see. Laughter he never shared with me anymore. These were not isolated acts. They were patterns, repeated with such consistency that they ceased to be suspicious coincidences and became undeniable truths. He was living two lives, and he had chosen to show me only the parts he couldn't hide. And perhaps what hurt most was not even that he was betraying me with someone else, but that he felt entitled to do it openly, without shame, as though the very idea of being accountable to me was beneath him. The shift in trust wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, like waking up one morning and realizing the house you live in has been tilted all along, and you only now feel yourself sliding. I started to test it in my mind. If he said he was working late, would I believe him? No. If he said he was out with friends, would I trust it? No. If he claimed that trip was just closure, just friendship, would I accept it? Not anymore. The realization spread like ink in water. Once trust is tainted, everything is colored by suspicion. And it wasn't paranoia. It was clarity. The sharp recognition of patterns I had once excused in the name of love. He, of course, noticed the difference in me. He noticed the way I no longer asked about his day with warmth, the way my eyes lingered longer on the clock when he left, the way my responses became clipped, not out of spite, but out of the impossibility of feigning belief. One night he even asked, his voice dipped in mock offense, "What, you don't trust me now?" It was almost laughable, because the question itself revealed he knew the answer. I didn't dignify it with more than a quiet glance, because saying the truth aloud, that I no longer trusted him, would have given him a weapon to wield against me, to accuse me of insecurity, of suffocating him, of being the reason he needed space. So I stayed silent, letting him choke on the words he had thrown at me days before, letting him live under the illusion that I was too passive to fight. But inside, the shift had already occurred, and once trust has shifted, there is no road back to where it stood. The suddenness of it was what startled me most. One moment, I had been a woman trying to reason with the man she loved, trying to make sense of why he would place me in such a humiliating position. The next, I was a woman cataloging evidence, watching his every move through a lens of suspicion sharpened by his own arrogance. I stopped seeing his smiles as affectionate, stopped hearing his excuses as plausible, stopped reading his silences as peace. Everything he did became suspect, every absence a question, every plan a betrayal waiting to be confirmed. The shift was complete, not when he yelled, not even when he dismissed me, but in the quiet aftermath, when I realized I could no longer picture a single scenario where his loyalty could be trusted. At night, when he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Once it had been comforting, a sign of intimacy, of safety, of the bond we shared. Now it felt like sleeping beside a stranger, someone who had burned the bridge between us, yet expected me to keep crossing it blindly. I thought about how much energy I had poured into us, how much compromise, how much forgiveness I had handed out over the years, and how quickly he had reduced it all to ash with a single declaration of defiance. It wasn't about the trip anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was about what the trip symbolized. His willingness to dismiss me, to lie to me, to replace me in spirit before he ever admitted it aloud. The shift in trust was sudden, because I realized, with startling clarity, that there was no repairing it. Once you've seen someone show you exactly how little they value your boundaries, you cannot unsee it. Once you've heard someone scream that your presence in their life is irrelevant to their choices, you cannot unhear it. Once you've watched someone plan a future with their past while pretending to still build one with you, you cannot unknow it. And so I stopped fighting for us, not outwardly yet, but inwardly, quietly, deliberately. I stopped protecting the illusion, stopped cushioning his ego, stopped believing in the story we used to tell ourselves. What he never realized was that trust isn't always taken with violence. Sometimes it simply slips away in the night, leaving behind a hollow space that no amount of apologies can refill. And mine had slipped, quickly and silently, leaving me with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating. I no longer trusted him, and that meant, for the first time in a long while, I was no longer bound to him either. It began with fragments, little whispers of truth that slipped through the cracks he had so carelessly left behind, threads that at first seemed too thin to hold weight, but slowly wove themselves into a tapestry I could no longer ignore. Betrayal rarely announces itself in a single explosion. More often it seeps into the fabric of daily life, disguised as coincidence, disguised as harmless detail, until one day the disguises fall away, and the truth stares back, unashamed. My shift in trust had already prepared me for it. I was no longer looking at him through the soft haze of love, but with the sharp clarity of suspicion. And once you begin to look through that lens, you see everything differently. even the smallest of details. The first clue was a slip of his tongue. He came home one evening, muttering about how exhausted he was from the week, tossing his bag onto the chair with that practiced carelessness of someone who expected their things to be picked up after them. As he showered, his phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't touch it, didn't even move closer, but the name that flashed briefly on the screen before fading made my heart tighten. It was her name, the ex he claimed this trip was about closure with. He had told me they hadn't spoken in months, that it was a sudden reconnection, purely for the sake of tying loose ends. But here she was, not a ghost from the past, but an active presence in his present. Later, over dinner, he mentioned a joke she had told him. He said her name absent-mindedly, as if it belonged naturally in his daily vocabulary, as if there was no need to conceal it anymore. When my eyes met his, he stuttered mid-sentence, and I knew then that the truth was closer than he realized. Then came the late-night calls. He thought he was being discreet, stepping into the hallway with his voice lowered, door half closed, but the human ear adjusts, and silence in a home carries every sound. I could hear the rhythm of his tone, even when I couldn't hear the words, the cadence of laughter that didn't belong to the kind he shared with me. He wasn't tense when he spoke to her. He wasn't defensive or curt. He was soft, almost boyish, the way he had been with me once in the earliest days when love was new and uncorrupted. That tone haunted me because it revealed something more dangerous than lust or nostalgia. It revealed intimacy, the kind of intimacy that shouldn't have survived an ended relationship, intimacy that was now being carved out of what used to be ours. There were objects too, small artifacts of a story he was trying to keep hidden, but that revealed themselves with careless arrogance. A receipt tucked into his wallet for a dinner 2 towns away on a night he told me he was working late. A travel-sized toiletry bag purchased at a store he never shopped at, dated only a week before. An email confirmation that appeared in our shared account. An accidental oversight, showing not just a flight booked, but a hotel reservation under both their names. When I confronted him lightly, with the casual air of someone feigning curiosity, he brushed it off as a clerical error, insisting hotels often attach names for convenience. But his eyes betrayed him. They flickered too quickly. His words rushed as though he hadn't prepared the script for this particular scene. What struck me most wasn't just the evidence, but the whispers beneath it, the way the universe seemed determined to place pieces of the puzzle in my path. Once, as he showered, his phone buzzed again, and though I never touched it, I saw the preview of a message float briefly across the locked screen. Can't wait until we're away. Just us. 6 words. Harmless if sent by a colleague. Devastating when sent by the woman he claimed meant nothing. My chest tightened, not with rage but with a quiet confirmation. The whisper had become a shout. And yet, I stayed silent. I didn't throw accusations. I didn't hurl the evidence in his face. Because by then I realized that catching a liar isn't about proving them wrong. It's about letting them prove themselves wrong. Every whisper was a confession he didn't know he had made. Every clue a thread that bound him tighter in the web of his own deceit. He thought he was clever, that he could juggle 2 worlds and keep them both in orbit without collision. But I knew the inevitable was coming, the moment when those worlds would crash into each other, and I would be standing there to watch the wreckage. There were moments when I wanted to scream, when the weight of pretending not to see was almost unbearable, but instead, I buried that impulse beneath the mask of composure, because I understood that silence was my weapon. By not reacting, I denied him the ability to twist the narrative, to paint me as jealous, insecure, irrational. By staying quiet, I left him exposed to his own recklessness. I was no longer the woman scrambling to save the relationship. I was the woman taking notes, archiving every whisper, every slip, every breadcrumb he left behind. The whispered clues didn't just confirm the betrayal, they transformed me. Each one pushed me further away from the role he had cast me in, and closer to the role I was beginning to shape for myself. I wasn't a victim stumbling in confusion anymore. I was an observer, waiting, calculating, preparing. And the more he underestimated me, the more dangerous I became, because he mistook my quiet eyes for blind ones. He thought I was still under his spell, still tangled in the web of his arrogance, when in reality I was already outside it, watching it collapse. By the time the whispers formed a clear chorus, I knew the trip he planned was not about closure, not about friendship, not even about nostalgia. It was about betrayal dressed as liberation, selfishness dressed as independence, cowardice dressed as honesty. He was too arrogant to see the difference, too entitled to realize the damage he was leaving behind. But I saw it all, and I was no longer afraid of what I saw. The whispered clues had given me clarity sharper than any confession could. He thought he was moving toward a future with her. What he didn't know was that I was already moving toward a plan of my own, one that would make his arrogance echo back to him louder than he ever imagined. The day the illusion shattered came not with a scream, not with some cinematic revelation, but with a quiet confirmation that left no room for denial. For weeks I had been gathering whispers, letting the pieces of his deceit fall into my lap without forcing them, cataloging each inconsistency, each slip of the tongue, each late-night call that carried more intimacy than he ever offered me anymore. I had built the map of his betrayal in silence, every clue like a pin on a board, connected by threads only I could see. But even as I pieced it together, there remained a part of me that longed for proof so undeniable it could silence even his talent for twisting narratives. The breaking point came in the form of that proof, ordinary in appearance, devastating in implication. It was a Friday evening, the end of a week that had already felt stretched thin with his absences and excuses. He returned home distracted, tossing his keys carelessly on the counter, rushing to the bedroom under the guise of needing to prepare for a meeting. His carelessness had become so predictable that I almost laughed at how easily he left his traces behind. That night, it was an envelope tucked halfway into his jacket pocket, a printed itinerary that must have seemed too unimportant to hide properly. I wasn't looking for it, not actively, but when I picked up his jacket from where he had thrown it across the chair, it slid out onto the floor like a confession begging to be read. My hands didn't tremble when I opened it. I had already imagined this moment too many times. Inside was a reservation for a hotel suite, his name alongside hers, not as an accident of booking, not as some administrative oversight, but printed deliberately, officially, boldly. The dates matched the weekend he had told me he was traveling for business. The destination was the same coastal city he had once promised we would visit together, and there it was. The raw, unfiltered truth staring back at me in black and white. This wasn't about closure. This wasn't about friendship. This was betrayal documented in ink. I stood there in the living room with the paper in my hand, the silence around me louder than any argument we had ever had. For a moment, I thought I might collapse under the weight of it, but what filled me wasn't hysteria. It was a strange calm, the kind that comes when the storm you've been waiting for finally breaks and the air clears. There was no more doubt, no more room for excuses. He couldn't twist this, couldn't laugh it off as paranoia, couldn't dismiss me as dramatic. The evidence was undeniable, and with that clarity came something else: resolve. When he emerged from the bedroom, freshly showered, humming to himself as though he were preparing for some harmless weekend trip, I tucked the paper back into the envelope and slid it quietly onto the counter. I didn't confront him then, not with shouting, not with accusations. I simply looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I saw him not as the man I had loved, but as the stranger he had become. His face was familiar, but his essence was foreign, and I realized in that moment that whatever bond we had once shared had already been severed long before I found that envelope. This was just the confirmation, the signed death certificate of our trust. The breaking point wasn't about the paper itself. It was about what it unlocked inside me. I no longer felt the need to question him, to demand honesty, to bargain with my dignity in exchange for scraps of reassurance. The time for negotiation was over. He had shown me who he was, not through one slip, but through 1,000. Not through words, but through actions, patterns, choices. And now that the mask had fallen completely, I could see the path ahead with startling clarity. I wasn't going to save us. I wasn't going to fix what he had burned. I was going to let him walk into his own trap, let him take that trip, let him believe he had won, all while I prepared the ground beneath his feet to crumble. That night, as he drifted to sleep beside me, oblivious to the fact that the paper he had tried so carelessly to hide had already spoken louder than he ever could, I lay awake, staring into the darkness. My mind wasn't clouded with sorrow anymore. It was sharp, alive with thought, with the beginning of a plan. The breaking point hadn't destroyed me. It had freed me. No longer bound by the false hope that he might change, I was free to act with precision, free to shape the narrative on my own terms. He thought he had silenced me with his arrogance, but what he had really done was open a door he could never close again. It's strange how calm clarity can feel like power. I expected heartbreak to come with tears, with sleepless nights, with the kind of despair that gnaws at the edges of your sanity, but instead, it came with a stillness that felt unshakable. He had chosen his path, and in doing so, he had carved mine. The breaking point wasn't the end of me. It was the end of him, though he didn't yet know it. And as I lay there in silence, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath, I knew that the storm ahead wouldn't be mine to weather. It would be his, and I would be the one holding the lightning. The morning after the envelope slipped from his jacket, I woke with a clarity I hadn't known in months, perhaps years. It was not the clarity of peace, not yet, but the clarity of direction, the unmistakable sense that a line had been crossed, and there would be no stepping back over it. He moved around the house with his usual careless rhythm, humming to himself as he prepared coffee, whistling under his breath as though he were a man with nothing to hide. He greeted me casually, as though we hadn't both lain in the same bed, while the truth sat like a weight in my chest. For the first time, I realized that silence could be my shield. I didn't need to meet his arrogance with confrontation. I didn't need to scream the evidence into his face and demand the apology he was incapable of giving. I needed only to stay still, to let him believe he had won, to let him bury himself deeper into the illusion he thought he controlled. The quiet decision was born in that stillness. I moved through the day with deliberate calm, watching him without appearing to watch, listening without responding, collecting every gesture, every smirk, every carelessly spoken lie. He thought he was in control because I wasn't fighting back. He mistook my silence for weakness, but in truth, it was the opposite. By not engaging, I freed myself from his script. He expected the jealous partner, the insecure woman, the storm of accusations he could twist into proof that I was irrational. Instead, he got the unshakable quiet of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. The game had shifted, though he didn't know it yet. The decision took form slowly, not as a burst of inspiration, but as the gradual settling of inevitability. I would not stop him from going on that trip. I would not beg, nor would I forbid, nor would I even warn him of what I knew. He would go, and in doing so, he would expose himself more fully than I ever could. His arrogance had blinded him to the danger of underestimating me, and that blindness would be his undoing. I didn't need to ruin him with rage. I would ruin him with patience, precision, and the quiet unfolding of truth at the right moment. In the days that followed, I began to prepare, not in outward, visible ways, but in subtle adjustments, quiet maneuvers that set the stage for what was to come. I gathered copies of what I had found, the receipt, the hotel confirmation, the message on his phone I hadn't dared to open, but had seen enough of to remember word for word. I archived everything with meticulous care, because I knew that when the moment came, I would not be confronting him in private. No, his betrayal would not dissolve into the walls of our home where he could twist the narrative to his liking. His betrayal would stand in the open air, undeniable, in front of others whose opinions he valued, whose respect he craved. He had taken something from me, but I would take from him something greater, his illusion of power, his image, his reputation. What surprised me most was not the anger. I expected anger, but the cold steadiness that settled into me as I made my quiet decision. It was as though the fire of betrayal had burned away all softness, leaving only steel beneath. I went to work as usual, answered messages, smiled at colleagues, laughed at jokes, all while carrying this new weapon of silence inside me. He thought the distance between us was temporary, that my withdrawal was a sulk that would fade, that he could return from his trip and smooth over the cracks with practiced charm. But I was no longer waiting for him to notice the damage. I was already laying the foundation for something he could not undo. At night, when he whispered excuses into his phone in the hallway, I no longer felt the urge to interrupt. I let him speak. Let him believe his secrets were safe. Let him pour himself deeper into the arms of a woman he thought would shield him. Every whisper became a rope he tightened around his own neck. And I stood in the shadows, not as the victim he thought he was creating, but as the quiet architect of his downfall. That was the essence of my decision. Not to fight, but to wait. Not to plead, but to act. Not to expose too soon, but to let him walk willingly into the trap his arrogance had built. It's a strange thing, how silence transforms once you understand its power. Before, I had feared silence, thinking it meant weakness, thinking it meant surrender. But now, silence became my ally. It was in the silence that I could plan, that I could watch, that I could sharpen myself into something he could not anticipate. He thrived on noise, on arguments, on shouting, on grand declarations of independence. He mistook volume for strength. But I had learned that strength can also be soundless, invisible, patient. And that kind of strength terrifies men like him most of all. The quiet decision was not about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about humiliating him for the sake of humiliation, or about clinging to the fragments of what we once were. It was about reclaiming myself, about refusing to play the role he had written for me. He had chosen arrogance. He had chosen betrayal. And I had chosen silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of strategy. I would no longer ask for respect. I would no longer beg for loyalty. I would take back my dignity, not by pleading for it, but by wielding it like a blade at the moment he least expected. As he drifted further into his world of whispered lies and reckless confidence, I withdrew further into my world of quiet preparation. Two parallel paths, both moving forward, both inevitable, both destined to collide. He thought he was building a future with her. I knew I was building the end of his story. And when that collision came, it would not be with noise or drama, but with the precise, devastating strike of truth delivered in silence that could no longer be ignored. That was the moment I became untouchable. Not because he hadn't hurt me, not because I wasn't broken in places, but because I had accepted the break and forged something harder in its place. The quiet decision wasn't just about him. It was about me, about the refusal to be diminished, about the strength to stand in the ruins without begging for rescue. He would go on his trip. He would believe he had won. But by then, the game would already be mine. The day of his departure arrived wrapped in a deceptive calm. He packed his bag with a careless arrogance, humming under his breath, moving through the house like a man unburdened by consequence. He tossed shirts into the suitcase, double-checked his toiletries, even whistled while folding the jacket he would wear at dinner with her. He thought he was untouchable, thought I was blind, thought my silence meant surrender. He didn't know that every moment of his performance was simply another rehearsal for the exposure that awaited him. I had made my decision, and the plan was no longer something abstract, but a living thing, breathing quietly in the background as I waited for the right moment to let it loose. I didn't confront him as he rolled his suitcase to the door. I didn't cry or beg or ask him one last time to reconsider. I kissed him on the cheek as though I were the dutiful partner he thought I had remained, wished him a safe trip, and smiled when he glanced at me with suspicion, searching for signs of collapse. There was none. He left believing he had won, believing he had carved his freedom out of my supposed weakness. What he didn't know was that my quiet was not defeat. It was preparation, and preparation had a way of becoming devastation when the curtain finally rose. While he was away, I set everything in motion. I gathered the evidence I had been archiving, the receipt, the hotel confirmation, the message I had glimpsed on his phone. I laid it out not for him, but for others, for the people whose respect he prized, whose opinions he fed on like oxygen, friends who thought him loyal, colleagues who believed him disciplined, family who had always seen him as the polished man he pretended to be. They would all see what I had seen, not whispered in private where he could twist the story, but laid bare in the open, where no spin could disguise it. Public exposure was not about cruelty, it was about truth. And truth, once dragged into the light, leaves no shadows to hide in. The moment came sooner than even I expected. A mutual friend had invited us both to a gathering. A dinner with familiar faces, people who had known us as a couple, who had believed in the story we once sold of love and stability. He returned from his trip flushed with arrogance, wearing the smile of a man who thought he had outmaneuvered suspicion, confident that his double life had slipped by undetected. He greeted everyone with charm, laughed loudly, poured drinks, and looked at me across the table with the smugness of someone who believed my silence meant complicity. He was wrong. I waited until the conversation turned to travel, until someone asked about recent trips, until he leaned back with that smirk and began to speak vaguely about business and coastal meetings. That was when I reached into my bag and placed the hotel confirmation on the table. Not with drama, not with accusations, just a quiet gesture, sliding the paper across the polished wood until it rested beneath the hands of the very friends he had just finished lying to. The room fell silent in an instant. His face drained of color as eyes darted from the paper to him, from him to me, from me back to the printed proof that told a story louder than any of his words could. He tried to laugh, to brush it off, to mutter something about mistakes in booking systems, but the evidence was too clear. His name, her name, the dates, the city, the suite, every detail undeniable. Every attempt at dismissal crumbling in the heavy silence of the room. Whispers began, quiet at first, then louder. People exchanging glances, the air thick with the weight of betrayal laid bare. He stammered, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to reclaim the charm that had always worked in the past. But charm cannot rewrite ink. Charm cannot erase the truth when it is staring everyone in the face. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. Exposure is most powerful when it requires no embellishment, no dramatic speech, no performance. I simply sat there, calm, composed, my silence sharper than any words. He had yelled once that he didn't need my permission, had screamed his independence as though it were a weapon. Now he sat shrinking under the eyes of people who had believed him honorable, people who now saw him for what he was. That was all I wanted. Not revenge, but clarity. Not screams, but silence heavy enough to crush his facade. The dinner ended with awkward goodbyes, with people avoiding his gaze, with friends who once clung to his every word now muttering excuses to leave early. He stormed out ahead of me, his face twisted with a rage that could find no outlet. But the damage was already done. The whispers had turned into a chorus, and the story would spread as stories always do. Not from me, but from them. From the witnesses who had seen the mask fall. He had lost control of the narrative, and once lost, it could never be reclaimed. That night, back at home, he erupted. He yelled, accused me of humiliation, accused me of betrayal as though truth itself were treachery. I let him rage, let him break himself against the silence I wore like armor, because in that moment, I realized exposure wasn't about destroying him. It was about freeing me. The world now saw what I had seen, and there was no going back to the prison of doubt, of self-blame, of second-guessing. His arrogance had built his downfall, and all I had done was hold up the mirror. Public exposure had changed everything. He could no longer hide behind charm, no longer lean on the respect of others to mask his betrayal. His image was cracked, his reputation slipping, his control shattered, and as I watched him crumble, I knew this was only the beginning. The war he thought he had won was only now truly starting, and the quiet decision I had made had transformed into a force that would carry me forward. He had exposed himself, and now the world would watch as the rest of his story unraveled. After the night of exposure, everything shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated, though perhaps deep down he had always feared it. Men like him live on performance, on carefully curated masks, on the charm they can project to friends and colleagues, weaving stories that protect them from consequence. The moment the mask slips in public, the story begins to unravel, and no matter how much they scramble to stitch it back together, the threads are already too frayed. I watched it happen to him piece by piece, not in a single dramatic downfall, but in a slow erosion that left him increasingly desperate, lashing out in every direction as the walls closed in around him. At first, he clung to denial. He told anyone who would listen that the hotel confirmation was a mistake, that I had misunderstood, that I was overreacting, unstable, jealous. He spun wild theories about clerical errors, about misunderstandings with travel agencies, about coincidences that only a fool could believe. But the more he protested, the more hollow his words became. His voice carried the nervous edge of someone who knows he is lying. His explanations tangled themselves into contradictions, and the friends who had once leaned in to hear his stories now leaned back with skepticism etched into their faces. His story was collapsing, not because I said a word, but because he had built it on a foundation of arrogance too weak to bear the weight of truth. It wasn't only his social circle that shifted. His family, the ones he had always counted on to see him as flawless, began to question. I saw the way his sister looked at me one afternoon, her eyes searching mine for confirmation, for the truth she suspected, but hadn't dared to voice. She had been at that dinner, had seen the paper, had watched her brother sputter and stammer when confronted with something he could not charm away. She didn't ask me outright, but the silence between us was different now. Charged, uneasy, no longer shielded by his narrative. He noticed it too. Noticed the way people who once embraced him now approached with hesitation. The way conversations that used to center around his wit now trailed off into awkward quiet. His image was bleeding, and he could feel the loss of control gnawing at him. At home, the collapse was louder, more volatile. He accused me of orchestrating his humiliation, of setting traps, of betraying him. He screamed that I had no right to share private matters with others, ignoring the fact that he was the one who had dragged betrayal into our lives. His rage was desperate, the flailing of a man drowning in the truth he could no longer contain. I let him shout, let him pace, let him twist himself in circles of accusation, because nothing he said mattered anymore. His story had already imploded outside these walls. He could break every glass in the kitchen, tear every photograph from the frame, but the world beyond had seen him for what he was, and no performance could erase it. And then came the ex, the woman he had built this entire illusion around. I don't know what conversations passed between them after the exposure, but I know she wasn't blind. She must have felt the weight of the whispers too, the shift in how others looked at her, the way her name was now tied to scandal instead of nostalgia. Perhaps she had believed his stories as much as I once had, believed she was special, different, the chosen one he would leave everything behind for. But lies rot quickly in the open air, and whatever enchantment he had spun for her began to crumble as surely as it had with me. Their alliance cracked under the strain of suspicion and blame, two liars turning on each other when the safety of secrecy vanished. I didn't need to hear their arguments to know they were happening. I could see it in his face when he returned home, tight-jawed and furious, his phone clutched too tightly in his hand, his eyes shadowed with the panic of someone losing control on every front. The collapse of his story wasn't a single moment, but a cascade of smaller ones. The colleague who avoided eye contact after a meeting, the friend who no longer returned his calls, the family member who canceled a visit without explanation. Each one was another crack in the mask, another reminder that charm cannot survive without trust. And as the trust evaporated, so too did the story he had so carefully written. He tried to shift blame onto me, painting me as vindictive, as manipulative, as unhinged. But the evidence was too solid, the whispers too widespread. The people who mattered no longer believed him. He had yelled once that he didn't need my permission. Now he couldn't even earn their forgiveness. In those weeks I saw him unravel. The man who once strutted through rooms with certainty now slouched, shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously. The voice that once carried arrogance now stumbled over excuses. The laughter that once charmed now rang hollow, brittle, forced. He had built his life on a performance, but the audience had turned away, and without them, he had nothing. His collapse was not just social or professional, it was existential. He didn't know who he was without the adoration, without the validation, without the illusion of being untouchable. And I watched it all from the quiet distance I had built for myself, no longer chained to his chaos, no longer bound to the desperate task of propping up his lies. The collapse of his story was, in truth, the collapse of him. And though he tried to fight it, tried to scream against it, tried to rebuild the mask with shaky hands, the cracks were too deep, the truth too loud, the silence I carried too sharp. He had thought betrayal was his freedom, but it had become his downfall, and the story he had once controlled was no longer his to tell. It was mine. The collapse of his story had left him exposed, but exposure alone is rarely enough to end a man who thrives on arrogance. He still clung to scraps of his image, still whispered excuses to anyone naive enough to lend an ear, still acted as though charm could stitch back the fabric that had already unraveled. But the time had come for the final cut, the moment that would not just reveal him, but sever him from every illusion of control he had left. I had waited, patient and silent, watching him stumble through the ruins of his own lies, and now I was ready to ensure that his downfall was not temporary embarrassment, but lasting consequence. The final cut was not rage, not violence, not a spectacle of screaming and broken plates. It was precise, deliberate, and above all, undeniable. I began with the evidence I had so carefully collected: the receipts, the hotel confirmations, the late-night calls recorded in patterns too clear to dismiss. I gathered them into a file, not for him, but for the places where truth could not be twisted. His workplace, where integrity was currency, where reputation was tied to responsibility. The company that held him in esteem, that trusted his word, that had always seen him as reliable. They would see what I had seen, not as rumors whispered at dinner tables, but as documents, undeniable and concrete. Betrayal is not confined to the bedroom when a man builds his image on loyalty. Betrayal bleeds into every space he inhabits, and once exposed there, it corrodes everything it touches. When the package was delivered, I didn't wait for his reaction. I didn't need to. I knew how the dominoes would fall. A man who preached discipline, who wrapped himself in the cloak of professionalism, would not survive the stain of scandal once it left the realm of personal failure and entered the public stage of his career. His arrogance had convinced him he could compartmentalize, that he could cheat in one world and remain spotless in another. But the truth doesn't respect boundaries. The truth bleeds, and this truth was about to flood the very ground he stood on. The aftermath was inevitable. He came home one evening, his face pale, his hand shaking as he slammed the door harder than necessary. He muttered about meetings canceled, about questions he couldn't answer, about colleagues who had looked at him differently that day. His phone buzzed constantly, each vibration another reminder that the walls were caving in faster than he could hold them up. He raged at me, of course, accusing me of sabotage, of revenge, of betrayal worse than his own. But the irony was too sharp to ignore. He had yelled once that he didn't need my permission, and now he couldn't even get their forgiveness. The final cut was not just professional, though. It reached into his personal world as well. Friends who had once shielded him stepped away, unwilling to be caught in the fallout. Family who had once believed him incapable of fault now spoke to me in hushed tones, seeking the truth directly because they no longer trusted his version. Even the ex, the woman who had once seemed to him like escape, like freedom, pulled away, her silence speaking louder than any goodbye. She had no reason to stay bound to a man sinking under the weight of exposure, not when the whispers around her name had grown too loud, not when the illusion of secrecy had been shattered. In trying to build a new beginning with her, he had destroyed not just us, but everything. And in the end, she slipped away too, leaving him with nothing but his own hollow echo. What struck me most during this unraveling was not his anger, but his disbelief. He had lived so long under the delusion that he was untouchable, that charm could mend every wound, that arrogance could disguise every flaw, that when the truth finally cut too deep, he didn't know how to live without the mask. He shouted, he pleaded, he cursed, he even tried moments of false tenderness, the sudden return of sweet words that once might have softened me, but I had already severed myself from his hold. The final cut was not only his destruction, it was my liberation. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I didn't stand over him with triumphant words or cruel satisfaction. The silence I carried was enough, because silence after betrayal is not emptiness. It is power. It was the silence of someone who no longer needed to argue, no longer needed to prove, no longer needed to beg for respect. He had lost everything he had tried to guard, and I had reclaimed everything he thought he had taken from me: my dignity, my strength, my voice. The final cut was not the end of him because I demanded it. It was the end of him because he had built himself on lies, and lies cannot survive once the truth is free. As I watched him stumble through the ruins, I realized the final cut was not about punishing him. It was about closing the door for good. No more whispers, no more evidence, no more waiting for him to reveal himself. He had been revealed. He had been undone. And in the wreckage, I no longer saw the man I once loved, but a stranger destroyed by his own arrogance. The final cut was not about him at all, in the end. It was about me, about stepping fully out of the shadow of betrayal and into the clarity of freedom. In the quiet after the storm, I found myself walking through the ruins of what had once been my life, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to pick up every broken piece. There is a strange relief that comes with finality, a liberation in knowing that something is truly, irrevocably over. His story had collapsed, his mask had fallen, his final cut had severed the last ties that bound us, and now I was left standing in the silence he had always mistaken for weakness. But silence, I discovered, was not emptiness. It was space. It was possibility. It was the air I could finally breathe without choking on his arrogance. Rebirth doesn't come in grand gestures or sudden epiphanies. It comes in the small, steady ways you reclaim yourself after being diminished for too long. At first, it was simple. Waking up without the weight of wondering where he was or who he was with. Cooking a meal and enjoying it without the tightness in my chest from listening for the sound of his key in the door. Sitting in the living room in the evening without the constant tension of waiting for his voice to rise, for his dismissals to cut, for his lies to tangle the air. The absence of his chaos was not emptiness. It was peace. A peace so deep and unfamiliar that I almost didn't know how to sit with it at first. But slowly, I began to remember who I was before his noise drowned me out. I started writing again, something I had abandoned long ago when every sentence felt like it would be interrupted by his laughter or criticism. The words came back to me slowly, like old friends returning after years of silence, and I let them pour onto the page without fear. I reconnected with people I had distanced myself from, friendships I had let erode because I had been too busy cushioning his ego, defending his choices, hiding his flaws. To my surprise, they welcomed me back without hesitation, offering kindness without judgment, proving that I had never been as alone as he had wanted me to feel. There were difficult days, of course, days when the memories of betrayal rose up like smoke, choking me with the ghost of his voice, with the sting of that night when he yelled that he didn't need my permission. Days when I caught myself replaying the moments of exposure, of collapse, of destruction, and wondered if I could have chosen differently. But rebirth is not about erasing the past. It is about learning to carry it without letting it crush you. I began to see those memories not as scars that disfigured me, but as marks of survival, proof that I had walked through fire and come out on the other side not burned to ash, but forged into steel. As weeks turned into months, I felt the shift more clearly. My steps grew lighter. My laughter came more easily. I looked into the mirror and no longer saw the woman he had tried to diminish, the one he had labeled jealous, irrational, controlling. I saw a woman who had chosen silence as strategy, who had exposed betrayal without destroying herself in the process, who had stood in the face of arrogance and refused to bow. I saw strength where I once only saw doubt. I saw resilience where I once only saw fragility. That was the essence of rebirth, not becoming someone entirely new, but reclaiming the self I had always been, the self he had tried to convince me was not enough. And what of him? He lingered in the shadows of whispers, still scrambling to rebuild his image, still trying to convince anyone who would listen that he had been wronged. But he was no longer my concern. His collapse was his own to navigate, his ruins his own to sift through. I had no desire to follow him into that wreckage. The final cut had freed me, and I had no intention of binding myself to his downfall. My rebirth was not defined by him. Not anymore. It was defined by the choices I made for myself, the life I chose to live without his shadow. There was a day, I remember it vividly, when I walked alone along the shoreline of that very city we had once promised to visit together. I went not as his partner, not as the betrayed, but as myself. The air was sharp with salt, the waves relentless against the rocks, the horizon wide and open. I stood there and realized that the trip he had once planned with her had never belonged to him. The places he claimed, the promises he broke, the dreams he corrupted, none of them belonged to him. They were mine to reclaim. And I did. I stood on that shoreline and felt the weight of his voice fall away, felt the echo of his arrogance dissolve into the roar of the sea. And in that moment, I understood what freedom truly meant. Rebirth is not the absence of pain. It is the transformation of it. It is carrying the wound without letting it dictate your steps. It is standing in the ruins and realizing you do not need to rebuild what was lost, but can instead build something entirely new. I no longer needed his permission. I no longer needed his validation. I no longer needed his presence to define my worth. I had found something stronger, something he could never take from me, myself. And in that discovery, I was whole again. So when I look back now, at the night he yelled that he didn't need my permission, I no longer feel the sting of humiliation or the ache of betrayal. I feel gratitude, not for him, but for the truth he revealed, the truth that pushed me toward clarity, the truth that forced me to find the strength I had buried. His arrogance became the spark of my liberation. His betrayal became the beginning of my rebirth. And in the end, that is what he could never control, never diminish, never silence. Me.